Makahanya haramita shingyo Ganji zaibo zagyo jinhanya haramita jishoken gon Gai gudo isai gu yaku shari jishiki.
A monk asked of Master Sosan, "Please sprinkle the compassion of your teaching, so that I may be liberated." "Who has put you under restraint?" asked the master. "No one." Master Sosan said, "Why then do you ask to be liberated?" At this, the monk awakened fully. This short passage is about the third Chinese patriarch, Master Sosan, who also wrote On Faith in the Heart, a famous poem that begins, "The great way is not difficult, it merely avoids picking and choosing." And in fact, that goes very much to the heart of what we're looking at here. Because here we're talking about liberation. And of course in Buddhism, and particularly in Zen, there's a lot of talk of this, liberation and freedom, so to speak. And a lot of the stories of the old Zen masters is about them acting freely. But that freely and that liberation is something that's very different from the ordinary view, or from the usual view of what freedom and what liberation is about. More or less, I think it's probably fair to say that when we think of freedom, we think about the freedom to do what I want. But this is not the same freedom at all. And liberation usually means liberation from those things that I feel constrain me from getting what I want or doing what I want. So again, it comes back to getting what I like and not having to put up with what I don't like. This is what I view as freedom. And so naturally I go after things like money and power because these two things can enable me to get what I want. But this is something that's very different from the Buddha's view. When the baby Buddha first emerged from his mother's side, if we go back to that story of the baby Buddha, we remember that having had that wonderful dream, Queen Maya, of the elephant entering her right side, the notables at the court had all prophesied that she would be giving birth to a great being. And she was on her way to her place of confinement when, being caught short in the Lumbini Gardens, standing, holding a tree with her right hand, the child emerged from her right side. And then taking 7 steps in the 4 directions, and wherever the baby's footstep came down to touch the earth, a lotus blossom, the classic symbol of the Buddha, the awakened Buddha, came up to meet his feet. Those 7 steps in the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east and west, and then holding one hand to heaven and one to earth, he declared, "Between heaven and earth, I alone am the world-honoured one." And hopefully, this has been said many times, but hopefully we are not going to take these things literally as some kind of historical fact, because they're clearly symbolic. But what does it symbolise, that going in the 4 cardinal directions? Well, the 4 cardinal directions really is a shorthand way of saying going everywhere, that baby Buddha can go absolutely anywhere that it wants. And this is, perhaps we sort of think, well, nowadays in our day and age we can get on a plane and go anywhere we like, and we think that we have relative freedom, and we do have a great deal of freedom, certainly a lot more than our ancestors ever did. But actually, do we have the psychological freedom and the spiritual freedom as well? And if we look a little bit more closely at that, it's not difficult to see that a lot of us do feel somehow that we are hampered. Somehow we feel constrained. Somehow we feel that we are carrying a burden. And this feeling of carrying a burden is not something new. Although there's a lot of talk of people feeling depressed and people feeling stressed and people feeling lots of demands on them these days. But of course there were demands in the past as well. People in the past had maybe slightly different demands, but they were there and they were very real. Things like poverty, things like famine, things like conflict and war. The ancient world was a very violent place, and also disease as well. Many things that we take for granted that we don't have to worry about. These were very real for people in the past. But even above and beyond that, there was something else. And this goes right back now to the Buddha's own insight, of course. After that insight, the first teachings that he gave was to those 5 ascetics, was the teaching of the middle way and also the 4 noble truths. And looking into the 4 noble truths, his diagnosis of the human condition was summed up in that word dukkha, which translates in English as the term suffering, but also has a more subtle connotation as well. It can mean dissatisfactoriness or a sense of being unfulfilled or not whole, not complete, a sense of emptiness. And this is not the emptiness of shunyata in later Mahayana Buddhism. This is a sense of nothingness. This is a sense of an absence, a lack within us. And of course, because we feel this lack, therefore this gives rise to desire, the desire to compensate for that lack. So the hungry man, he looks for food. The thirsty woman, she looks for something to drink. And the one who feels vulnerable looks for security or looks for power. And whether those lacks are true and real and existing or whether they are imagined, it makes no difference. The heart responds anyway by now putting us under a feeling of constraint. We now feel compelled because this is a mark of desire. When desire arises and the hotter the desire, the more potent the desire, then the more compelled we feel by it. And of course, one of the main outlets for our desire, certainly for us human beings, this is above and beyond the instincts for things like safety and food and shelter and so forth, is our own imagination. And our own imagination, when it is under the influence of the passions, our imagination is a wonderful thing, but under the influence of the passions, it can often work against our sense of well-being, and does work against our sense of well-being, creating and spawning world views that are often troublesome, hostile, dangerous for ourselves, and compelling us to all sorts of actions of body, speech and mind that in colder blood we would never consider. And this really runs all the way through, not only from our individual experience, but also particularly now in our collective experience. And if we look out into the world, we can see that people are compelled by collective views as well, that are driven by very powerful passions, very powerful currents that seem to be running their course despite what reason may say, or despite what our sort of cold-blooded view might inform us. It doesn't make any difference. When we are driven by those powerful forces, the world appears in a very different way. If we think back to a time when I was under that very strong compulsion, whether it was anger or whether it was desire or anything really, or anxiety, for example, or stress, I behave in a very different way. And the reason I behave in a very different way is that at the time it seems the rational thing to do, and in a sense it is the rational thing to do. It's just that the way that the perception is being warped by the passion doesn't reflect necessarily how things really are. When we're under that influence of the passion, things go into a very split state, into a very black and white state. I must have this, I cannot put up with that. And usually when we look at these worldviews that are certainly troubling us nowadays, whether individually or collectively, it comes down to that. And this is how the Buddha's diagnosis went. This is that dukkha, this suffering, this which is also restlessness as well. The whole point of powerful passions, powerful emotions, is that emotion actually shares the same root etymology as to motivate. Motivation, emotion, because that's what emotions do. They move us to actions of body, speech and mind. And they will give us no rest until they have become exhausted in that way. Unless, of course, we found a more subtle way to work with them, which, of course, when we work with the fires, this is what we are learning to do through the power of restraint and also examination as well. So in this, Master Sosan is being asked to sprinkle the compassion of your teaching that I may be liberated. Those 7 steps that the Buddha took, showing that actually that insight and that power and the Buddha can go everywhere. No wonder, therefore, that between heaven and earth he is the world honoured one. And we do feel this. We do feel this in our world. And this is why we seek liberation as well. And there's that old Gnostic view, which actually goes back really a lot further to the ancient world too. But that original Gnostic view, which is that somewhere out there is a world of liberation, and whether it's a divine world in a different sort of spiritual sphere, or whether it's a very material world, perhaps in a utopia on earth. It doesn't matter whether it's in heaven or whether it's in the future. The point is, it's an invisible world that I cannot see right now, but I can imagine it. And this is the thing about a desire when it arises. The desire, as long as it remains unfulfilled, produces a vision. Desire never comes up just as a feeling. It comes up as a conception as well. We conceive of the thing, of the end state, of the desired end state, of what we want to escape to. And this is the whole process for it, even going back to early Buddhism. The escape from samsara to nirvana also has this. Hence why in Mahayana Buddhism the two things were brought together, and we have that famous saying from the northern tradition: samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara. That the only thing that's different is that it's a different way of seeing the same thing. The escape from the wheel of life is not the same as a literal escape from the world, but we can fall into that very easily because we tend to project our dissatisfactoriness, the inner sense of dissatisfactoriness, and also our inner conflict with that, out onto the world and out onto other people and out onto situations in the world that we experience. And we play them out. The world becomes a theatre in which each of us contributes and plays a part, acting out these essentially blind forces more often than not. Hence the connection between liberation and insight. Hence why the monk in the end of this story awakened fully. And we always have that in these stories, don't we? That the monk awakened fully and the Buddha awakened fully and so forth. Because it's in that awakening that there is the escape from suffering. But first of all, we have to come to the realization of how we are constrained. Because we certainly feel constrained by things. As I say, that Gnostic view is that therefore we're always seeking a way out of the world, and whether we see the world as my past, my upbringing, my genes, or whether I see it in such things as the society or government or consumerism or materialism or something like that. There's always this edge in me that's seeking to escape from that which is unpleasant to something that is more pleasant. And to make that leap, to see the world in that way and to act out in that particular way, often flies in the face of the facts and the way that the world really is. And I remember many years ago when I first started, or not long after I'd started this Buddhist training, and I went on my first 5-day Zen sesshin. A sesshin is a 5-day retreat. And we used to go to a little Catholic priory that was run by some nuns. And there were quite a lot of us, in fact too many for the dormitories. So half a dozen of us had to sleep in the zendo, in the meditation hall. For the fact that we didn't have rooms of our own, there was another little community room that was given just to us, where we could stow all our gear, and there was a few chairs, and we could go and sit in there if we wanted to just sort of sit down quietly away somewhere. Now, being on a session is pretty tough. There's 8 or 9 hours of zazen, where you can't move. It's very regimented, it's very disciplined, there's no talking, there's no distractions, so things like reading and games and TV and radio. Obviously, this was in the day before mobile phones and all the rest of it, but certainly those are all switched off, not available. We cannot leave the grounds, so we're constrained by that as well. And although physically our needs are catered for, we can sleep and we have plenty of food. The nuns used to cook loads of food for us, and we all used to eat very well indeed. There was that creeping feeling of being cut off, as it were. Literally, the sort of tendrils of I were being cut back. My usual distractions, the usual ability to go and do what I please, and make myself a cup of coffee when I please, choose what I eat and all the rest of it, those things were cut off. I mean, on the one hand, we'd all volunteered to go. We knew we were told what to expect. We'd paid some money to go. We'd taken time off work, etc. But on the other hand, when it begins to bite into us, this practice of restraint, because this is what it is, essentially, there's a reaction, quite naturally. And it's tough. I mean, sitting for 8 or 9 hours a day, whether on a chair or on a cushion, is hard on the body, even with the breaks in between. And so I remember by about the third day of this 5-day session, after a very generous lunch, I walked into this little community room, and as I walked in, out of the corner of my eye, I saw that there was somebody sitting in a chair, and as I walked in, he suddenly hid something, and so naturally I slew round to have a look and see what it was. And when he saw I wasn't anybody of any real consequence, he sort of relaxed, and out came this Cadbury's chocolate bar, this whisper bar, and he proceeded to eat it. Now, there was nothing particularly written down to say that we could not do this, bring our own sweets in, but there's a sort of spirit of the thing that one doesn't bring in extraneous food and bits and pieces. One lets those things go at the priory gate and just gives oneself completely into what is there. We're provided with everything we need, tea and coffee, meals, etc., a bed and all the rest of it, that there's no need to bring anything extraneous in. But I looked at him, and it was one of those interesting moments when when you look at somebody in the eye, and they look at you, and something sort of passes between you, an understanding, because we both knew what this was about, because I felt it too, and it was this. It was, look, this is really hard. It's very wearing, both physically and psychologically, and I just need a treat, just a little uplift to get me through this. If I can have this little thing to look forward to, then I'll be fine. And I know that feeling exactly, because at the time I was a smoker, and at the sessions, the smoking breaks were also really important. That's exactly how I felt about those two. So for him it was chocolate whispers bars, for me it was cigarettes, and I always remember that. But it was some time later that I recalled, how phony that really is. Here we are. This planet is about sort of 4.5 billion years old, I think, at the last count, and life appeared on it about 3.8 billion, something like that, ago. Most of the time, for most of the past, it was just very simple life forms, single cell life forms. But at some point in the more recent past, it became multicellular, it became very varied and much more complex. Various species arose, life came out onto land, some went back into the ocean again, but some remained on the land and colonized all the available space. And for most of that time, It's been a dog-eat-dog world out there. Nature is a dog-eat-dog world. It's pretty tough. I know we sort of ooh and ah, and we sort of go out. It's like when you go out on a summer's day and the sun's shining and everything seems wonderful and the flowers are out and you can hear the birds singing, and they are singing. But they're not singing for me. They're basically either protecting territory or looking for a mate. They're getting on with the two most essential things that most of life gets on with, and it's tough out there. And as well as that, there's times of famine. As well as that, there's also disease. There's also avoiding predators or looking for something to eat. There's a lot that can go wrong and does go wrong. And then along comes humanity, finally evolves, and we add a few more things like war and so forth into the mix. It's pretty tough. And when we think about it, we are the descendants of those that survived all that, which means that in us there must be some incredible resourcefulness, that's been handed down to us. As Master Mumon says, the treasures of the house do not come in through the front gate. Everything that we have, that resilience, that ingenuity, that ability to adapt, and so on and so forth, and that ability to be able to put up with a great deal, really. When we look back in history and the savage times that people have had to put up with, and the way that people have weathered it, really quite amazing, awe-inspiring even. And the fact is that's in each and every one of us as well. But, then along comes the idea, then along comes these conceptions of myself. I start to think, oh, but I can't survive this. Oh, but, unless I have those 2 cups of coffee in the morning, I simply can't cope with the day ahead. And if I can't have that chocolate whisper bar, if I can't have that cigarette, I simply can't cope with it. But what happens when life comes up and takes those things away from me? And when the situation doesn't provide me with this? This is precisely what something like a session and also our daily life practice is about. It opens our eyes and makes us realize that what's putting us under constraint is my own view of what it is that I must have and what it is that I cannot stand. But what happens then if those things are taken away from me? Do I collapse? Well, yes, if I'm too wedded to those notions and those opinions, and my whole emotional household is geared towards getting what I want, and there's no room for anything else, then the strength is gone. The strength has been co-opted into desire. So when we work with those fires, when we are practicing that straightforward religious practice of constraint and restraint, do not think that this is somehow a life-denying practice. It's not at all. It's actually taking back what has been co-opted and taken away by the desires that operates through my wants, through my judgments, and through my opinions. And coming back to this story now, again, we need to be a little bit careful, I think. The monk asks Master Sosan for the teaching so that he may be liberated. And the master responds by that question: who has put you under restraint? And in some ways this is a similar story and has similar echoes to that exchange between Bodhidharma and his successor-to-be, Eka. If you remember, Eka comes up and also asks Bodhidharma, please, my heart is not at rest, please pacify my heart. So in that story, Eka also realizes that he is under constraint. His constraint is that his heart is restless. In other words, it's in the grip of dukkha. And Bodhidharma says exactly the same to him. He says, show me this heart, and I will put it at rest for you. And so when the monk says, when Master Sosan says, who has put you under restraint, I think we have to imagine that there's a sort of break here. That the monk probably goes away now, and taking that question, who has put you under restraint, really sits on it. In the same way that Eka, I think it's fair to say, would have had to go away and look for that heart, that restless heart. So although it's written as if this one thing follows after another, I think it's probably fair to say that the monk actually goes away and really investigates, because this is what the Buddha and this is what the teachings ask us to do. To really look in, who is it that puts us under restraint? When I feel I cannot go on, who is it actually that's putting me under restraint with that? And then at some point later, he comes back. And when he comes back, in fact, he's already really awoken to the truth. He's seen it, because he replies, no one. And in the same way that Hui'ke also came back to Bodhidharma, and in reply, he said, he replies saying, but I cannot find that restless heart. And Bodhidharma, of course, replies, there, I have put your heart at rest. And Master Sosan sort of echoes that by saying, then why do you ask to be liberated? If no one is putting you under restraint, why are you asking to be liberated? Obviously. At this, the monk awakened fully. So, in that way, possibly that the monk maybe hadn't fully awakened, but he was on his way, and he was just given a final nudge by Master Sosan. If no one puts you under restraint, then you do not need liberating. And of course, this is it in the end. When I'm under constraint, the natural feeling is to, because I project out those conflicts, those inner conflicts onto the world, I think that I must manipulate the world. But the Buddhist way is always to recognize that the constraint is in one's own heart, and that if that is liberated, then one can act freely. That's not to say that there are no such things as bullying, and there's no such thing as war, and there's no such thing as oppression and so forth. Of course those things are there. But also to recognize that oppression is a state of heart as well as an outer reality too. And that even if one is constrained outwardly, there is still the possibility of being free within the circumstances. I remember it being put very clearly to me once as saying that in winter in China, up in the mountains where the bamboo grows and the snow falls heavily on the ground, and it can fall to a depth of 6 feet. And the bamboo, which is very flexible, simply lies down when the snow falls. If you watch bamboo when the snow falls, you'll see that it bends over and it will lie right down on the ground, and the snow will pile up on top of it. But the bamboo does not feel oppressed by the snow. It knows that in 6 months' time, spring will come, the snow melts, and then the bamboo simply comes back up again. It has that flexibility, but it also has that resilience. If it was broken by that 6 foot of snow, then it would not rise again. And of course, in Chinese Buddhism, and Zen comes from China, obviously, originally, it has that. It looks to nature for those fine examples. And I think that's a very good one. So there we have it, Master Sosan, who said, the great way is not difficult, it merely avoids picking and choosing, because the more I am wedded to that picking and choosing, the more I am wedded to getting what I want. And I must have it. It's not a case of saying, oh, I fancy a cup of tea now. It says, but I must have that cup of tea or I die. If it really is like that, then it breaks us. But if we can hang loose to those things a little bit more, having got used to a little bit of that, giving up my own way, just a little bit, just here and there, then it makes a real difference, and we can move through the world much more freely, and also live in a state of less fear towards the world. Because the more that I want something, the more frightened I become of not getting it. And so, therefore, the contrary is also true. The less constrained by my own desires and must-haves and opinions I am, then the more we hang loose to it, the less afraid we become of the world in general.